The Middle Ages, often referred to as the medieval era, spanned roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century. This millennium marked one of the most transformative periods in European history, shaping the political, social, and cultural foundations of the modern world. Between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the dawn of the Renaissance, the Middle Ages are often misrepresented as a dark and stagnant time. But in reality, it was an era full of contrasts: brutality and beauty, ignorance and knowledge, war and peace. At the dawn of the Middle Ages, Europe was fragmented into countless kingdoms and fiefdoms, each ruled by lords who swore allegiance to kings or emperors. This system, known as feudalism, structured society in a rigid hierarchy. Peasants toiled under the protection of their lords. Knights upheld chivalry and military strength, and nobles maintained power through land and allegiance. The Church, meanwhile, held immense influence, shaping laws, education, and even kings' decisions. The life of a medieval peasant was harsh and demanding. Most worked the land, living in small villages with simple homes made of wood and thatch. Their world revolved around the agricultural calendar and religious festivals. Disease, famine, and war were constant threats, but so was community and faith. The Church's reach was profound. It provided spiritual guidance, education through monasteries, and a sense of order in an often chaotic world. Peasants, or serfs, had few rights and were bound to the land they worked. Their labor supported not only their families, but also the lords who owned the estates. In return, they were offered protection from invaders and the promise of a small plot to cultivate. However, their lives were marked by toil and hardship, with little opportunity for social mobility. Knights were the epitome of medieval martial culture. Trained from boyhood in combat, horsemanship, and courtly manners, knights swore oaths of loyalty and protection. The code of chivalry demanded bravery, honor, and service to the weak. But the reality was often more complex. Knights were also warriors in brutal wars, participating in bloody feuds and crusades. The Crusades, a series of religious wars sanctioned by the Church, aimed to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control and left a lasting impact on East-West relations. The First Crusade was launched in 1096, sparked by Pope Urban II's call to arms. Thousands of knights and peasants marched towards Jerusalem, driven by religious zeal, the promise of indulgences, and the hope of land and wealth. While the Crusades succeeded temporarily in establishing Christian states in the Levant, they also led to centuries of conflict, trade, and cultural exchange between Europe and the Middle East. Castles stood as symbols of power and protection. Built on strategic locations, they were both military fortresses and residences for the nobility. Life within castle walls was a mixture of ceremony and defense preparations. Lords and ladies held banquets, while servants and soldiers attended to daily needs and security. The architecture evolved to meet the demands of warfare, with thick stone walls, moats, and towers designed to repel invaders. The construction of castles also spurred advances in engineering and architecture. Motte and Bailey castles, common in the early Middle Ages, gave way to stone keeps and concentric designs that maximized defense. The presence of a castle often meant control over trade routes and the surrounding countryside, reinforcing the lord's authority. Education and knowledge were largely preserved by the Church's monasteries and cathedral schools. Latin was the lingua franca of scholars, and texts from ancient Rome and Greece were copied and studied. The Middle Ages saw the founding of the first universities, like Bologna and Paris, which would become centers of learning for theology, law, and philosophy. Despite this, superstition and ignorance coexisted with burgeoning intellectual movements, often leading to tensions such as the Inquisition. Monastic orders like the Benedictines and later the Franciscans and Dominicans played a crucial role in intellectual life. Monks copied manuscripts painstakingly by hand, preserving classical knowledge that might have otherwise been lost. Universities emerged as places where the clergy and nobility's children could be educated, gradually expanding to include subjects beyond theology. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century, was a devastating plague that wiped out an estimated one-third of the population. This catastrophe altered every aspect of society. Labor became scarce, peasants demanded better conditions, and feudal structures began to crumble. It was a grim reminder of human vulnerability, but also a turning point that eventually paved the way for social and economic transformation. The plague's origins traced back to Asia, spreading along trade routes to Europe. Symptoms were horrific: painful swellings called buboes, fever, and death within days. Entire villages were depopulated, economies collapsed, and the Church's inability to stop the disease shook people's faith. Yet, the survivors found themselves in a position to demand higher wages and better treatment, sowing seeds for the decline of serfdom. Culturally, the Middle Ages were rich in art, music, and literature. Gothic cathedrals rose towards the heavens, their stained glass windows telling biblical stories in vibrant colors. Troubadours sang of love and heroism, while epic poems like the Song of Roland celebrated knights and battles. Manuscripts were illuminated with intricate designs, and religious festivals brought communities together in shared rituals and performances. The Gothic style, emerging in the 12th century, emphasized height and light. Cathedrals such as Notre Dame in Paris and Chartres Cathedral showcased flying buttresses and pointed arches, engineering marvels of their time. These structures were more than places of worship. They were symbols of divine order and human achievement. By the late 15th century, changes were underway. The Renaissance, sparked by renewed interest in classical antiquity and humanism, began to spread across Europe. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg revolutionized information dissemination. The rigid structures of feudalism started to give way to centralized monarchies and the early modern state. The Renaissance brought a new focus on individual potential and scientific inquiry, challenging medieval scholasticism. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo would soon redefine art, while explorers like Columbus set out to discover new worlds. These shifts marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. The Middle Ages were not simply a dark tunnel between ancient and modern times. They were a complex, vibrant era, filled with contradictions and innovations. From the muddy fields of peasants to the grand halls of kings, the echoes of this time continue to influence our world today.